When I was a senior at Columbia, I had the pleasure of bringing Stokely Carmichael to the campus to speak. This was in the early 80s, so by then, of course, he had already changed his name to Kwame Toure as a way of paying homage to the two great African revolutionaries, Kwame Nkrumah and Stokely Carmichael. Now, I had arranged with Stokely's people to meet with him privately the afternoon before he was supposed to speak that evening for a 2-hour recorded interview. They balked at the suggestion of a 2-hour interview. They offered me 45 minutes, and of course, I accepted it. The actual interview actually lasted an hour and 15 minutes because once Stokely sat down to speak with us, he said he had no intentions of leaving until he had answered every question to the best of his ability and to our complete satisfaction. So I met him that afternoon on 116th and Broadway. It was just him and his one security person, and I escorted them across campus to the Malcolm X. I remember as we walked across campus that afternoon, he reminisced about his days as a student at Howard University. And two other things, really stood out in my mind about that short walk across campus. Number one, the way the man carried himself like a prince, and the way he was dressed in this white suit, which made such a dramatic impression because it stood out in stark contrast to his dark skin. And also that nobody recognized him. That really surprised me. I hadn't expected that. So when we got to the lounge, we were met there by my friend Darwin Malloy, who was also a student at Columbia, and he actually conducted most of the interview. So Stokely was thrilled to death to see that we even had a Malcolm X lounge at an institution like this. And since we were interviewing him in Malcolm X Lounge, naturally one of the first questions we asked him was, did he know Malcolm X? And he said that he had never met Brother Malcolm, but he had great respect and admiration for him. And one of the things that he admired most about him was that Malcolm was not afraid to speak the truth under any circumstances. In fact, he'd been taught by Elijah Muhammad to speak the truth, to spread the truth, and they saw this as one of the ways to uplift the consciousness of our people. So that's why Stokely was very disappointed when Malcolm X was punished for speaking the truth after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, when he said this was the case of the chickens coming home to roost. And what Malcolm meant by that when he said it was that all the violence that our government had been spreading, particularly in foreign countries like Vietnam at the time, this violence, in a karmic sense, it was justice that one point that violence had to come home, and it did come home and claim one of our own. But now we know that his words even had a deeper meaning than that, because now we know that John F. Kennedy was assassinated, killed, murdered, slain by his own government. So Malcolm's words, this is the case of the chickens coming home to roost, true words were never spoken. Okay, now you have to understand, this was one of the greatest honors of my life. Here I was sitting face to face with one of the living legends from the civil rights movements of the 60s. This is a man that knew Dr. Martin Luther King personally, had marched with him, had met with him privately numerous times and planned strategy and campaigns with him, and debated back and forth with him about his position on nonviolence. This was a man that had broken bread with both Fidel Castro and Ho Chi Minh. He was the former head of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was an honorary member of the Black Panther Party, and as such, he knew personally both Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton. He had also faced down the Klan in Lowndes County, Alabama in 1965 when they went on there on a mission of voter registration. Lowndes County, Alabama in 1965 did not have one black registered voter in the whole county. And Stokely Carmichael and SNCC helped to change all that. Stokely identified himself that afternoon as an organizer for the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. He didn't claim any highfalutin fancy title other than organizer for the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, which was an organization started by Kwame Nkrumah many years earlier. And he believed that revolution was the solution. He believed that capitalism and racism were interwoven, that one could not exist without the other. They both went hand in hand. He believed that imperialism was the highest state of capitalism, and that boded well for anyone that valued their freedom. And he wanted to replace this system and replace it with socialism. So he said that this system had to be completely torn down, couldn't be reformed, couldn't be rectified, had to be completely torn down and rebuilt with something newer and something wholly new, different, and better. And to Stokely, socialism was the answer. He did have a fancy name for the type of socialism that he advocated, and I believe he called it dialectical socialism or something to that effect. But the whole point of the type of socialism that he advocated was a type of socialism that was self-aware, self-critical, and constantly made adjustments to get better and better and better. So although publicly Stokely Carmichael expressed solidarity with the Black Panther Party, he shared with us that afternoon that he was never really an active member in the Black Panthers. He was only an honorary member. The title that they gave him was Prime Minister of Information. Again, it was an honorary title, but both Stokely, Huey, and Bobby Seale knew that that small distinction would be lost on the general public and on the mainstream media, so they purposely set out to create a perception that he was an actual member of the Black Panther Party. Ideologically, he had one major difference with them. Stokely said that they were reformers, and he himself, of course, was a revolutionary. So therefore, he could never, embrace the organization fully and 100%. Stokely had great, tremendous respect for Martin Luther King, great respect and admiration for him. He saw Dr. King as a man that was absolutely and 100% committed to his people. He saw him as a principled man that could not be co-opted or bought off, and that's why he had to be taken out. Now, according to Stokely, when King spoke out against the Vietnam publicly for the first time in that speech that he gave at Riverside Church in Manhattan, that's when the FBI moved against him. Hoover at that point had already called him the most dangerous man in America because of his ability to rally and mobilize the masses. Now, when he spoke out in the Vietnam War, they saw that as threatening because there were far too many people, members of the ruling class of this government, getting filthy rich on that unjust war in Vietnam. And almost a year to the day that he gave that speech at the church, he was murdered. Again, murdered by his own government. Now, Stokely had ideological differences with Dr. King as well. His main point of difference is that he could not see the value of embracing nonviolence as a way of life in the midst of a liberation struggle. When Martin Luther King spoke about getting to the promised land, he was clear that he meant getting to the promised land through nonviolent means. When Stokely spoke about freedom, when Stokely spoke about revolution, it was equally clear that he meant freedom by any means necessary. In this respect, he echoed the sentiments of Malcolm X, and he reiterated that point to us that afternoon. He wanted to go after his freedom by any means necessary. Now, although he had this fundamental difference with Dr. King, what I appreciate about Stokely is that consciously he made a decision, along with the rest of the leadership of SNCC, never to criticize King publicly. Never to criticize him publicly. Whenever the media asked him, hey, how do you feel about Dr. King? Love the man, support him 100%. Okay, so I thought that was very instructive. Stokely spoke that evening. Over 2,000 people were in attendance. And to show you how much respect and admiration he has for Dr. King, here we are decades after his death, and Stokely still publicly talking about him. He asked us, how many of you love the late great Dr. Martin Luther King? And thousands of hands went into the air and started cheering. And then he said, how many of you have ever read a book by the man? Almost every hand went down. I believe that Stokely cited a statistic that only 3% of the American population had ever read a book by Dr. King. So, and his point is this: if you've never read a book by the man, then how can you say to authentically know him? And if you don't know him, then how can you claim to have really loved Dr. King? So Stokely had two simple calls to action for us that evening. He said, number one, get informed, and then get organized. He was a big believer in organization. As he called it, organization. Join organizations. As far as getting informed, he said, listen, there's only two ways to acquire knowledge in this world, directly and indirectly. The best way to acquire knowledge indirectly is through reading books. And speaking of books, before I forget to mention this, at the time that he came to the Columbia to speak, Charles B. Hamilton was a professor there. I ran into a bunch of times and actually met with him one evening too, because he was hashing over an idea for a new book. And it was pretty surprising because apparently these two guys didn't have any relationship at this point by the early 80s. And Stokely said that although he had signed onto the project, most of the ideas expressed were those of Charles Hamilton and not his. So that was a pretty surprising revelation. So now we really pressed Stokely during the interview. We really pressed him on this question of violence. We asked him, this revolution that you're talking about, and he said that the final step in that revolution is the seizure of state power. So we asked him, again, what is the role of violence, and are you envisioning violence or advocating violence, here in the United States to overthrow this government? He didn't want to answer that question directly, but what he basically said is that, listen, if we take the political education that he's offering us through the All African People's Revolutionary Party, that's where you'll find the answer, and we'll be able to answer that question yourself, basically. But that wasn't good enough for us, so we kept pressing him on the question of violence. And here's what he said. He said, the United States government is the most violent empire in the history of human development on the planet Earth. The Roman Empire, Attila, Mao, Mussolini, Hitler, none of them have as much blood on their hands as the United States government. So do you believe that this government will allow the people of America to seize power without unleashing a storm of terror, repression, and violence such as the world has never seen before? Gentlemen, this is a question that you must answer for yourselves. So, again, he didn't come out with a direct answer, but, you read between the lines there, it's not difficult to do. Now, again, Stokely emphasized that the final stage of revolution, the final step, is the seizure of state power. So if you look at the recent events in Africa with the ouster of Mubarak, and for those of you who don't know, Egypt is in Africa, okay? But he would be very happy about the ouster of Mubarak. He would applaud that because the All African Party, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, believed that Africa is primary. So he believed that wherever Africans are in the diaspora, we should concentrate all our resources and all our efforts and struggle to liberate Africa first. Once that is done, and then the diaspora would, would fall in place, basically, is what I got out of it. So that's the one thing that I really had a problem with that afternoon, because for me, what has to be primary for me is the place where I'm living and dealing and struggling, every day of my life. So I couldn't embrace this idea about making Africa primary, but again, he would be very happy about the events in Africa with the ouster of Mubarak, but he would be very quick to point out that what's happening in Egypt right now is not a revolution by any means. He would call it an uprising, you can call it a rebellion, but when the dictator of a nation appoints a vice president, which in itself is absurd, then the vice president announces that the military is going to be running the government until unspecified date. This election, if it ever goes off in September, that does not constitute a revolution, because the people have not stepped up and taken control of the government. Okay, let me end just by saying this. Decades after he spoke to us, I learned that Barack Obama was in the audience that night, and he makes reference to this event in his first book. And so I have to end by asking you this. How many of you supported the candidacy of Barack Obama by voting for him. 97% of African Americans voted for Barack Obama. And how many of you to this day still support his presidency? Well, at that point my hand goes down. How many of you have joined the Negro Thought Police encircling your wagons around this man and tried to create an environment, a climate in this country where it's politically incorrect to criticize him? And lastly, how many of you have ever read a book written by Barack Obama? Yeah, I thought so. Cut.